Welcome back to Science. Let's take a look. You're listening to KTAL LP FM, 101.5 in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and also streamed live at radioketal.org, QUETAL, and lccommunityradio.org. With me in the studio today is Professor Kathryn Hanley from biology at NMSU, and we're talking about these wildly interesting emerging viral diseases. So we broke off a few minutes ago, and we were talking about dengue, which you mentioned had been in Philadelphia in the U.S., and we're going to look into how it disappeared and why it's coming back.
So as I mentioned, dengue was in Philadelphia. It was up and down the East Coast. And another viral disease was also occurring, and that was yellow fever up and down the East Coast. And that was a huge scourge. People were terrified of yellow fever. In fact, we almost shut down the entire city of Memphis because yellow fever was so rampant in Memphis that it didn't seem like the city could be sustained.
You're kidding.
I'm not kidding.
How big was Memphis at the time?
I don't know what the population was, but it was a well-known city.
What, you would evacuate the city?
You would not only evacuate it, you would cease to have Memphis. There just would not be a Memphis anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. So there was then, in the early and progressing into the mid-1900s, an enormous effort to eradicate the mosquito vector of these viruses, Aedes aegypti. And that effort was almost successful. So the numbers of Aedes aegypti were cut down enormously in the Americas, but there were some residual populations. And then into the 60s and 70s, there was exhaustion with this effort, and so it waned. And the problem with an effort at eradication is if it's not all gone, it's going to come back. And that's what these mosquitoes did. They roared back across the Americas. They established not only their original range, but in some cases they expanded beyond their original range. And now we see huge numbers of Aedes aegypti across most of the tropical and into the temperate Americas. And along with them, a resurgence in dengue, continued yellow fever, although now we have a very good vaccine for yellow fever. And we see that when chikungunya virus and Zika virus arrived in the Americas in 2013 and 2015, respectively, they were welcomed with open arms by the local mosquitoes who were easily able to transmit them.
So how does it affect the mosquitoes themselves?
It doesn't. So if you think about this evolutionarily, the virus gets most of its mobility from its mosquito vector, and so viruses that crippled their mosquito vectors wouldn't last very long. And so generally when we see mosquito-borne or arthropod, insect-borne pathogens, the vector of that pathogen does fine when it's infected, and the disease is reserved for the host.
Going back to the vector Aedes aegypti, that's endemic in the U.S.
It's endemic in the U.S., and for the last 2 years, members of my laboratory have been working intensively in New Mexico because if you were to have looked at the maps of Aedes aegypti in the U.S. 2 to 3 years ago, you would have seen that the mosquito spread from the East Coast out through Texas, and then you would have seen it pick up again in Arizona and distributed across to California. And New Mexico looked like it was Aedes aegypti free. Well, terrific, except that was simply a lack of surveillance in New Mexico. So I now have the job of convincing my colleagues outside of the state that not only do we have this mosquito across southern New Mexico, but we have it abundantly across southern New Mexico. And they will look at me shocked and say, no, isn't it too dry? No, the mosquito says it's not too dry and that we do a lot of watering of lawns, etc., and that it's doing just fine. And so we have huge infestations of Aedes aegypti from really from the eastern to the western border of the state.
Can you tell the subpopulations, the different strains of mosquitoes, and where they might have moved across?
So we're working on that with a colleague at Yale. We've done an initial analysis. I should say that our Yale colleagues have done an initial analysis. And our mosquitoes are very closely genetically related to mosquitoes in southern Texas and northern Mexico. So at the level of discrimination we have now, it's one big population. However, we're working on more detailed analyses to ask whether we can make finer scale distinction and look at the origins of our New Mexico mosquitoes.
Back to eradication or the attempted eradication. Was that basically insecticides and draining areas with water?
It was basically insecticide. So the difficulty with Aedes aegypti, the reason that it's such a terrific vector for human viruses, is this mosquito loves people. It likes to feed exclusively on human blood. It likes to live inside of human homes in stored water. And so you can't just go drain swamps as you might do to get rid of malaria. You actually, if you're going to tackle Aedes aegypti, you have to not only be around people's homes, but inside people's homes, eradicating standing water sources.
Ooh.
Yes, and that makes it incredibly difficult.
What kind of standing water sources would be in people's homes?
So Aedes aegypti can lay its eggs and have successful development in as little as a tablespoon of water.
Oh.
So if you're just looking at your own home, go look at your gutters, look at your flower pots, especially after a rain. Look at your dog's water bowl if it's outside, and
Right.
ask, does the water in there stay there for 7 days? If it does, and it's as much as a tablespoon, you can produce Aedes aegypti.
Wow. Okay. Llewellyn, my wife, made a pond, and she has lots of fish. So she she occasionally does some observations. She doesn't seem to see any
Right.
mosquito.
Aegypti.
Yeah.
Well, the fish are probably eating the mosquito larvae. In fact, putting mosquito fish into sources of water can actually decrease mosquitoes. But Aedes aegypti generally don't prefer very large bodies of water, even so large as ponds.
Really?
They really like things like gutters, and their absolute favorite all-time breeding site is old tires. And as I've been working in southern New Mexico, it is extraordinary to me how many people have old tires in their backyards. And I pontificate about this, and then I go into my own backyard and realize I have an old tire, which is the basis of my daughter's seesaw, and it has water, and it has Aedes aegypti. So any of us can get caught out with not noticing where the water is.
Well, I remember that there was an importer of used tires from Southeast Asia who brought in, was it a different species
So
of mosquito?
different species of mosquito. So that's Aedes albopictus, which is also a good vector for all of the viruses we were just talking about. It's not quite as good as aegypti because it's not quite as obsessed with people. So Aedes albopictus will also feed on dogs and cattle, and it tends to be what we call peri-urban, so not quite in the center of the city, but at the fringes. But yes, tires
why
are...
would that be not in the center, just not enough water sources or something?
It may be that it is at the center of the cities. It's outcompeted by Aedes aegypti. So there's a complicated competitive balance between those two species.
I'm going to jump back to treatment because you mentioned that the Zika virus can be treated especially to avoid microcephaly in...
Well, no, that's a goal. So right
That's
now,
a goal.
that's a
Oh.
goal. There are no drugs to treat any of the arthropod-borne viruses. You can treat the symptoms of some of them. So, for example, for chikungunya, you can offer some relief for the joint pain that occurs. But you cannot specifically treat any of these viruses yet.
Okay.
And that's why there is a desperate push to get these treatments before we get another flare-up of viral transmission.
Sure. Well, if you just go into other viral diseases, Tamiflu, how does that work? And is that effective? I think it just sort of slows down.
Yes. So in order to understand how it works, you need to understand a little bit how influenza replicates. So influenza gets into a cell via a receptor called sialic acid. And that works great. But the cell is covered in sialic acid, and eventually the virus has to get back out of the cell. And if the sialic acid is still there, it's going to get trapped on the surface of the cell it just infected, and it can't then go on to infect new cells. So it possesses an enzyme called a neuraminidase that lets it cut that sialic acid and essentially turns it loose from the cell to go infect new cells. Tamiflu interferes with that neuraminidase and prevents it from cutting itself loose. But that means that if you don't get your Tamiflu fairly early in infection, many of your cells are already infected and you're going to have some manifestations of disease. That's why physicians will encourage you that if you have the flu to get treated as quickly as possible.
Right. I forgot how many hours, 48 hours or something
right,
like
but
that.
Beyond that, first of all, flu is incredibly fast in its infection. So you get exposed to flu and very often you're sick the next day, compared to something like dengue where you might be sick 7 days later. So it's really fast, and you want to therefore get treatment before the bulk of the virus has built up to the point that you really can't control it anymore.
That makes me think, where do these viruses go in your body?
Mm-hmm. That depends very much on the virus. So if it's yellow fever, it's infecting the organs, and it's called yellow fever because you become jaundiced, your liver is infected, and you turn yellow. If it's influenza, it's infecting cells in your respiratory system. If it's just your upper respiratory system, you're not too sick. But if it gets deep into the lungs, then you can be very sick indeed. If it's Ebola, it's infecting just about every cell in your body. And that's one of the reasons why people are dying at such extraordinary rates.
Right. Is there any relationship of Ebola to these other diseases we've been talking about?
It's very difficult to discern the relationships, the deep relationships among viruses. So there's, as you know, there's a tree of life. And that sorts all organisms, bacteria to humans, in their relative relationships. That is built around the genetic sequence of something called a ribosome. That's what makes proteins in the body. Viruses, by definition, don't have ribosomes. They don't have genes for ribosomes, and we can't map them onto the tree of life. Moreover, they mutate so fast that their genetic signatures of relationship are obscured really quickly. So we don't actually know very well how viruses are related to each other.
But Ebola is also an RNA virus?
It is also an RNA virus. That I can tell you. But
there's some what's Marburg? And is that related?
Marburg?
As far as you can tell?
Mm-hmm. So we can, at close levels of relationship, we can tell relationships. And Marburg and Ebola are very, very close cousins. They belong to a group called the filoviruses. And so Marburg is very similar to Ebola. It has many of the same symptoms of Ebola, a slightly lower fatality rate, and it's found more in East Africa. We're pretty sure we know the bat hosts of that virus.
I've been there.
Have you been to Marburg?
No.
Oh, to Ketum Cave?
To East Africa.
Yeah,
no,
okay.
No. I've also had the yellow fever vaccination, which I am grateful for because it appears to confer lifetime immunity. That's the idea?
That is the finding, yes, that once you are vaccinated, you never need to be vaccinated again. So in many ways, it is an ideal vaccine.
It was somewhat uncomfortable, as I remember.
Yes, and many people note that vaccines, especially those delivered by needles, can be uncomfortable, but I assure you it's less uncomfortable than
having yellow fever.
And I am a huge proponent of vaccines, and I'll just make a plug. I want to be very clear that I'm not a physician and I don't get to make healthcare recommendations.
But you play one on radio.
But it is a very bad flu season this year. You only need to turn on the radio to know that all lower 48 states are now at high flu activity, which is extremely unusual. It's only January. We're not officially even into flu season yet.
Really?
Not typical flu season. The flu vaccine is out there. It is not perfectly effective, and I get confronted by a lot of people telling me, why should I get vaccinated if it's not perfectly effective? Seatbelts will not always save your life in a car accident, but you should wear them for sure, because sometimes they will. And I would advocate that you should get your flu vaccine for sure, because 30% of the time it will help you, and that's not terrible odds.
Right. Okay, we'll get back to this in a minute. We're going to take a short station break here and come back and listen to us.